Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to be talking about the 64 Audio Neo. This is a 9-driver universal IEM with 8 balanced armature drivers and a dynamic driver to handle the bass frequencies, and this comes in right at around $1,700. So this is a very high-end IEM from 64 Audio. Let's take a look. Just like with my other reviews, you'll be able to find written information on this IEM on headphones.com on the main page there, as well as reviews from other users as well who've had a chance to try it out. So definitely check that out. I'll leave links in the description for that. For this review, we're going to go through the build quality, design, and comfort. We'll talk about detail retrieval, speed, dynamics, soundstage, imaging, and timbre. We're going to go through the frequency response and tonal balance, give a couple comparisons, and then ultimately decide whether or not it's worth it. And let me actually begin by talking about some of the accessories here, because the 64 Audio Neo is not just one tonality. You actually get 3 different Apex modules that do different things, and we'll talk about that. But I also want to mention that they've actually updated the case, or the little box that it comes with, and this is a much nicer design for the case. It's much easier to throw into a backpack and carry around and use than the previous plastic hard shell case that they had. Now I get that one's quite functional, but this one is a little bit easier to use, and let me just it looks nicer as well. But it just sort of hangs out in there. This is sort of like a leather material, so it's a much classier look about it. The design here is the usual sort of 64 Audio type of shell. The Neo uses a very striking blue design here, if you can see this. So it's almost like what I would describe as a cerulean kind of look to it. So that's pretty cool. But the cable, unfortunately, is also the usual 64 Audio style cable, which, while yes, quite functional, is a little bit on the stiffer side, and it can get tangled a little bit. But the comfort for these IEMs, they fit me great. I've heard reports that these actually don't fit everybody as well, but they fit me really, really well. So I've got no complaints there. And you do get a number of tips in the box. I find for comfort, these foam tips work really well. And then also, I tried these with the Deconi tips, and they didn't really change the tuning all that much. And the Deconi tips are also quite comfortable. Now I'm going to hold this up here, and I want to draw your attention to this little thing that sticks out here, which is called the Apex module. And there are 3 different ones that this comes with. I'm going to show you the other 2 here. The one that comes installed by default is the M15, and there are others here as well. The M20 is the silver one here, and then you get the MX, which is the black one on the other side. And they do different things to the frequency response. In particular, they change the bass. But in theory, they're also supposed to change the air pressure and also the isolation that you get to various different degrees. And I didn't notice a huge difference overall between the M15 and the M20, but the MX is quite different, and we'll talk about that when we talk about frequency response. Let me just show you, you can take them out here kind of like this. And there, I've taken out the Apex module here like that. It's a very small little piece, so don't lose this. And then it just sort of slides back in here, and you can swap them out depending on the tuning that you like. Just know that with the Neo, you don't just get the one tuning, you get multiple different tunings depending on the Apex module that you're using. Now, let's talk about the sound. So for detail retrieval and image clarity, what allows you to sort of peer into the music the best, I find the Neo to be quite good, but I still think that at $1,700, it's not up there with the likes of 64 Audio's own U12T, which is only a little bit more expensive. So if you're after like the most detailed IEM that you can get for the price, I think the U12T would probably still be worth the upgrade over the Neo. But overall, this does actually use a TIA driver for the treble, and the treble is well detailed. It's just, it doesn't stand out as much. The other thing is that the overall image clarity here is a little bit overshadowed by the bass presence that you get with the M15 module and the M20 module. With the MX module, it's a little bit better there. But overall, I find that it still doesn't quite compete with the U12T. For speed, I think it is on par with other 64 Audio IEMs in like the mids and in the treble, especially, with the TIA driver there. But at the same time, it's not as tight and well controlled down low as other multi-balanced armature driver IEMs are. But remember, this is also using a dynamic driver for bass frequencies, and the trade-off there is also a positive one because you get much better punch and slam and impact out of it than you would with strict multi-balanced armature IEM. So I really like the hybrid design here, and I think it's effective. While the detail might not be, best in class at this price, the dynamics definitely outshine the price point here. At least when comparing to other multi-balanced armature driver IEMs. I think there are other IEMs that are just pure dynamic drivers, like the beryllium ones, that outslam this at around this price, notably the Dunu Luna, which is a single beryllium driver IEM. So if like slam and dynamics is like your thing, the Dunu Luna is definitely a little better than this, but for the hybrids, I think this is right where it should be, and it's really, really nice. For soundstage and imaging, okay, this is interesting because for soundstage, I find that the 64 Audio Neo is a little bit kind of tighter and closed in. This may have more to do with the tonal balance than anything else, and the overall frequency response, but I do find this not to be as spacious as even lower priced IEMs like the Campfire Aura. Remembering, of course, that the Aura has a bit of a dip there in the mids that may be responsible for why it has such a spacious presentation. Now, that's not to say that it's disjointed, it's just not as spread out and spacious as I may have liked. It's not bad, it's just not as good as other IEMs. For the imaging, though, the imaging is perfectly fine. I have no issues with in-head localization and placement of instruments and things like that. It's got really good separation there as well. Lastly, for timbre, I find this to be quite good, and I don't get any of that, balanced armature timbre that I sometimes worry about. And I think, again, this probably has to do with the implementation of the balanced armature drivers that are going on in here. And then, of course, for the bass, you do get the dynamic driver. So that's a really good thing. And actually, my experience with 64 Audio's TIA driver IEMs, the sort of, somewhat tubeless driver IEMs, they often have better timbre than what I'm used to with other multi-balanced armature driver IEMs. So I really like that quality about it. And so overall, for technical performance, it does really well in some aspects, and it does sort of average on others. And I think it really just depends on what you're keying in on and what you value. Now let's talk about frequency response and tonal balance. And what I'm going to show you guys here is 3 different frequency response plots for the 64 Audio Neo, so you can see how the different Apex modules affect the frequency response. So let's look at the graph here. So the default one that comes installed is the blue line here, and that's the M15 module. And apparently, they're titled M15 and M20 because that is the amount of volume that they isolate. I didn't notice a huge difference between the two for that. And also, you don't really notice a huge difference as far as the bass presence that you get. But it did show that the M20 was a little bit more elevated than the M15, but we're talking like 1 dB at most, down in the bass and in the sub-bass regions there. The most interesting one, in my opinion, is the MX module here, which to my ear makes it a far more balanced sounding IEM overall, because if you look at where the bass presence is on the Neo with the M15 module, it is enormous. Like, this is a Basshead IEM like nothing else. Like, this is crazy. I think for IEMs, I'm like almost a Basshead because I like having a bit more bass presence when I'm walking outside with IEMs and using them portably. I like that. I think I would have liked something almost in between these two. The tuning changes here are done through the Apex module for, basically everything below 1K hertz. And I'm told that there are other Apex modules that you could, in theory, get. I think there's one from Fur Audio that may make it so that it's kind of in the middle here, and that might be suitable for you. For my preference, though, I think I would generally prefer the MX module for classical and jazz and acoustic music. And I think I'd prefer, the M15 module for anything that's sort of like, pop, rock, electronic music, anything a little bit more upbeat. That's a little bit more fun there. Keep in mind, though, that because these are using dynamic drivers in the bass, the overall bass level and energy, it's not going to look as intense as it sounds, because a dynamic driver in the bass is going to be more impactful than a traditional balanced armature driver in the bass. So when you look at like how crazy the blue line is here, like the M15 and M20 modules, that gives you a sense of, it's not just that it's elevated and it's a dynamic driver in the bass. So it's just a bass monster. There's no two ways about it. Moving up into the mids, I actually kind of like the mids here because you still get a decent amount of mid-range presence, and you do get upper mids as well. There's a lot of IEMs that I've been evaluating that kind of don't have much going on here for upper mids. It's not crazy, but it's definitely got a little bit of presence there, and I like that. And then you do definitely notice this 5K hertz peak a little bit. I want to also just mention that because this measurement rig here is using the Gross RA 0402, there's a little bit of damping going on around 8K hertz that I think is probably more than what it actually sounds like. So I think the overall energy level here would be a little bit higher in reality, but it's just there to damp some of the, coupler resonance that would otherwise exist there. So what's going on here with the treble is that you get a bit of a peak there at 5K hertz. It's not enough to cause percussion compression, but when I first heard this IEM, like my very first impressions, I think the tips that were installed on here made it so that the treble energy above 5K hertz was a lot lower, and this accentuated the peak. And that made it so that it had a bit of the percussion compression. But with these foam tips that I have on here now, it's actually not a problem. And I don't hear the percussion compression issues whatsoever. And then the treble overall, though, is still a little bit on the relaxed side. So it's well extended and it's really resolving and it's really detailed. It's great. But it is a little bit on the, withdrawn, subdued, non-fatiguing side of things. And I think when you're using the MX module, I think that's really, really good. The fact that this has a bit more of like an overall warmer tilt to it, with a little bit more of a relaxed treble is on its own, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the fact that the Neo's treble is still really well extended is really nice. So what I really like about the overall tuning here, especially with the MX module, is that you get a somewhat of a relaxed, non-fatiguing kind of tuning in the treble that's really well balanced in general with the right tips. There are some where the nozzle protrudes all the way to the front, and that just did not work for me at all because it subdued the upper treble. And actually, I tried this with the final E tips, and for the most part, they didn't really do it for me either. But nonetheless, the overall tuning here is, again, sort of a warm, relaxed, kind of non-fatiguing, smooth, and yet well-extended kind of presentation that if you just want to get into your music, it's actually really, really good for that. And you're not going to get any sibilance or any issues with harshness or anything like that. It's really well balanced throughout the entirety of the treble. It's just maybe like a couple dB lower than I think I might prefer. I think overall I might prefer a little bit more energy there. But with all of that said, I do personally find that with the M15 and the M20 modules, the Neo's bass is just overbearing still. It does still get to be a little bit much for my ear and for my taste, the music that I like. So I end up preferring most of the time the MX module, which is still a little bass elevated in the frequency response. I just think it's elevated to a more appropriate degree because remember, we got a dynamic driver in there as well, which is making that punch a little bit stronger too. So let me give a couple comparisons here compared to the Campfire Aura. Now that's an IEM that's a bit less expensive, but I think that the detail retrieval of the Aura is at least as good as the 64 Audio Neo. Now the Aura is it's a totally different IEM because the Aura doesn't have anywhere near the bass that the Neo does. The Aura is a strictly balanced armature IEM, but I just wanted to bring that one up as a comparison, as an example of, a less expensive IEM that competes for detail retrieval and also is a little bit more spacious of a presentation for soundstage. So if you're looking for detail in soundstage and you want a more, let's say, like linear kind of sound, like not as bass emphasized, that's a good choice there. Even though my preference would be with the Neo and the MX module, just because the overall balance there is a little bit better for my taste. Of course, the dynamics on the Neo are also way better, so this is a much more kind of punchy and engaging sounding IEM. And then I also want to compare this to the Empire Ears Hero, which is the new one that just came out. And while the Hero, I actually prefer the overall bass level of the Hero. I prefer its bass energy. It's a little bit less than that of the Neo with the M15 and M20. But the nice thing about the Neo is that it has much better treble balance. It's not as peaky in the treble there, and it's a little bit more, relaxed and non-fatiguing, while the Hero is just a little bit more on the aggressive side. I think some people may like that. I mean, it's much more of a V-shaped kind of sound, and it's more just about the bass and the treble, whereas with the Neo, it's just more of an overall balanced sound signature with just a bass emphasis, even though the Hero's technical aspects are also very competitive, and I think are very similar to that of the 64 Audio Neo. In any case, compared to the 64 Audio U12T, which is still my sort of like gold standard, high-end IEM. I much prefer the U12T for overall tonal balance, and I think the U12T is also more detailed. But if you're somebody who wants that bass punch There's really no substitute for this. I mean, there are, but at this price, the Neo is definitely one of the better choices for that. And it retains a similar kind of exceptionally well-tuned treble with really good treble extension that's still really smooth. So if you like that quality about the U12T, you're going to like it about the Neo as well. It's just that the Neo now has the dynamic driver in the bass, and if you're using the M15 or M20 modules, you get a ton more bass. So if you thought that for some reason the U12T was lacking in bass, which I don't personally, the Neo might be, you know, one to look at. I mean, in some ways, this is very similar to the bass of the Trio, the Tia Trio. In general, I'm reminded of that kind of hybrid sound that you get from their higher end IEMs, like the, you know, over $2,000 hybrids that they have. But personally, I would just spend the extra money to get the U12T because it is just that much more, you know, detailed, at least to my ear. And it has surprisingly good bass response as well, even though it's just all balanced armature drivers in that one. Compared to the Dunu Luna, while the Luna has a bit more of that sort of physicality and impact and dynamics to it, which it's a single beryllium driver IEM. The overall bass presence of the Neo with the M15 and M20 module is more, so it would probably be perceived as having more impact in the bass, but the tonal balance for the Neo is, in my opinion, quite a bit better. It's not as, you know, emphasized there around like 2 and 3K hertz, whereas the Dunu Luna is quite shouty in that region, at least to my ear. It's very emphasized there. So in my opinion, I would take the 64 Audio Neo over the Dunu Luna for its overall balance in the upper mids and treble. But if you're somebody who prefers a more forward mid-range, upper mid-range there, you know, then maybe it's worth comparing the two. Now, let me give a conclusion. Do I recommend the 64 Audio Neo? Well, I certainly recommend this with the MX module. I think that's a fantastic sounding balance overall. It's a very, you know, engaging yet non-fatiguing, smooth, well-balanced kind of sound that is quite, let's say, my version of neutral. I'd say it's pretty close to what I would consider neutral for an IEM. Maybe a little bit relaxed there in the treble. I'd almost prefer a little more treble energy there. But overall, I think it's a great sounding IEM. If you're a bass head, absolutely, I recommend this with the M15. It's wild with the bass here. But if you're somebody who wants really tight and distinct and well-controlled bass, you know, I don't think this is going to be quite the right IEM for you, because the bass does extend a little bit far for my taste. I think initially when I heard this, I was like, oh yeah, that's coming down at the right spot. And it does for some tracks, but then I think for the majority of music, I think it does extend a little bit too high there, at least, you know, for my taste. And, you know, $1,700 is a lot of money, and it's also a very competitive price range. There's a lot of stuff in this range, but I really think that its biggest challenge comes from 64 Audio's own U12T, which is only a little bit more expensive. And if you're willing to spend $1,700 on an IEM, you're probably willing to spend the $2,000 to get a U12T. You know, it's not that much more. And to my ear, the U12T is the one that's still more competitive for, you know, technical performance, for detail retrieval and all that stuff. It's just that it doesn't have the dynamic driver in the bass. So if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of the detail and clarity for the benefits of a dynamic driver in the bass with more bass and punch and slam, then yeah, I do recommend the 64 Audio Neo. And I really think where the Neo's value proposition comes into play is what you're able to change with the Apex modules. You know, if you want something that's more linear and more balanced, like I mentioned, the MX module is going to give you that. If you want something that's that guilty pleasure, kind of fun, massive bass kind of sound, the M15 and M20 modules are going to give you that. If you want to mess around with other modules that are out there, you can do that as well. And so you're not just really getting one tuning with this IEM, you're getting multiple different tunings that you can change depending on the genre of music that you're listening to, the mood that you're in, your environment. You know, if you're on a bus and there's a low frequency noise floor, you can add the M20 module in here and you'll be fine. So really, I think that's the biggest strength that this IEM has. It's got a great tuning there for its mids and treble. It's non-fatiguing, and then you can change the bass level depending on, you know, your preference. And I think that's great. While it's a little bit outclassed by its own sibling, the U12T, the Neo is a solid hybrid IEM counterpart that anybody who's looking for a dynamic driver in the bass should strongly consider. Anyways, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.